Welcome to this new book news reading, celebrating writers whose books were published during the pandemic lockdown. My name is Karen Schubert, and I'm the director of Lit Youngstown, a literary arts nonprofit in Northeast Ohio. We have programs for writers, readers, and storytellers, including a first Wednesday reading series, which this week will feature poet Craig Pollinich and fiction writer James Winters. Many thanks to the Natalie and James Andrews Foundation for support for this series. And more information is available at lityoungstown.org. So thank you for joining us. I'm very pleased to feature these three writers today, and congratulations to them on their publications. We'll follow the readings with a conversation about these books. Susana H. is the author of 7 full-length poetry books and 5 chapbooks. Her first collection, The Scottish Café from Slapering Hol Press, was released in a dual language English-Polish version, Kawiarnia Szkocka by Opole University Press. Her book is Dead Shark on the N Train, published by Broadstone Books, which won a Pinnacle Book Award for Best Poetry Book. Welcome, Susana.
Thank you so much, Karen, for organizing this. So this is Dead Shark on the N Train. It's hard to see with the glare, but what you can see is a 1930s painting of the New York City subway system with a shark on the floor. This is a book in which gender and gender violence are threaded through, and sometimes other forms of violence, and sometimes other incursions which are more subtle. So I will read a variety of poems from here, and I'm going to start with one that was inspired by active shooter training that we had at my university. Of course, people aren't getting shot at universities right now because pretty much nobody is physically at a university, but this was, of course, a problem in the before times. So this is active shooter. He had a well thought out system. He appeared off-brand weird. He was solo 98% of the time. He wasn't stupid any of the time. He appeared to know the building. He planned the operation. He was a quiet man, everyone said, never a problem. He was a problem. He was a monster. He was not a monster. He did a monstrous thing. He shot for 7 to 11 minutes. We didn't pay that extra minute of attention. We tried our concealment. The weapon's bullets penetrated our desks. The weapon's bullets penetrated the partitions between our cubicles. 38 cal, 9 mil, 12 gauge, M67 for the AK-47. The weapons penetrated our file cabinets. We confused concealment and cover. We had no cover. We were lizards, dreaming like birds. This poem is called Walking Home. The girl walking home alone doesn't know what to do about the stranger who calls her name. He claims he has a gun. His knowing her name is a gun. He blocks her way. Rail track, chain link fence, no parking sign. It's like that test she had in school yesterday, having to choose which animal doesn't belong. She guessed it was the cow. This girl knows nothing of farms. On her left, the empty tennis club. In front, the man who snarls, he will kill her. Let me see the gun, in her piccolo voice. A train rushes by. If she were in it, her life would be different. The world is full of noise, weeds, cigarette butts, rusted car, locked shed. She runs. She doesn't know if he can keep up. He's too old to catch her. He screams again, I'll kill you. She doesn't look back. So as I was telling Karen earlier, the only place I've ever lived other than New York City was Youngstown, Ohio, where I spent 2 years. And there's a couple poems in this collection that reference Youngstown. And I thought I should read them, it would be appropriate. So this one only really references Mahoning, which is I think it was an avenue. I haven't been there for a while, but I think it was an avenue, not a street. And it's called It Hardly Seems to Belong to You or Me. At a restaurant on Mahoning, supposed to be Chinese, except for the white waitress refilling our water glasses, white bread on the table, an iffy special with white sauce, I tell you about a crime terrible in its ordinariness, a quarrel over money. He knifed her 9 times. It happened somewhere else, but seems more likely here. Maybe every town's the same that way. The story's such an old one. Specifics don't matter. Maybe you don't need to listen. Maybe I just need to talk, to tell you she made the papers back in New York. Snow falls outside, white slush filling up spaces not yet filled by words, dribbling the window, its leaky seals. Menominee Indians believe the universe started with a drop of water. Every killing, every poem, every storm. Truth seems ancient, surrounded by moisture. A whole history of the world wrapped in one wet, whitened narrative, not about who found her, the way her sister's face looked. I'm always interested in history, and so this poem speaks more to the history of Youngstown, Ohio, which had an organized crime presence, a large one for many years, and this is called When My Youngstown Was Crime Town. Disappeared in daylight, left their cars, engines warm, disappeared in explosions, engines bombed, disappeared at night, presumed dead, later fished from the Mahoning, bullets to the head. They lived on streets where no one heard anything, no one saw anything except 15-foot mill flames stretching towards sky. One of the assassins finally talked, his memory of the Milltowns mob, a camera. For months, people joked about how a leg was found on the roof of Lustig's Floorshine shoes. That used to be a store that was on the main street. I don't think it's there anymore. So I am also interested in art, and art frequently finds its way into my work. And this poem, the title of the poem is also the title of the piece. It's based on a work by Giacometti, and it's called Femme Égorgée, which in English means woman with her throat cut. His decade of sex and death, the woman with her throat slit, a small nick in the carotid, her tiny head reaching for air as if bronze can gasp. Venus flytrap woman, spiky ribbed cockroach woman, convulsing, disemboweled. I have destroyed her, Giacometti said of busts of his wife, Annette. Serial expression of anger and guilt. He was better with hookers, the ultimate in womanhood. Like his art, endless repetition. It was the usual good girl whore dichotomy, as in his obsession, the prostitute Caroline, who stubbed out a cigarette on her portrait's well-placed bones, its jittery paint. Fail better, his friend Beckett wrote, fascination, lit the neck, skeletal woman without pedestal, infertile man, quasi-impotent, someone brutal in the vicinity, that crucial gaze. The middle section of this book is based on the crime scene dioramas of a woman named Frances Glessner Lee, who created in the early part of the 20th century 20 doll houses, which was a typical endeavor at that time for women who didn't work. The difference being her doll houses were all crime scenes or scenes of death with models, little tiny models, miniatures of dead bodies in them. So the middle section has some photographic reproductions of her models, has some prose poems about her life, and has some ekphrastic poems based upon the models. So I'm going to read just two examples of poems based upon the doll houses. This one is called Small Caliber, and it's based on a model of a two-story porch in which there is a dead figure lying on the sidewalk, a woman. Small Caliber. Where are you going with a 22 in your hand, showing off your Second Amendment, shooting off your mouth, shooting her, struck dumb in the chest, struck dumb boy. He struck her shooting upward from the street, anonymous shot. She on a chair, still in her apron and hairnet, hanging the weekly wash on the two-story porch, body falling, Sunday morning. Husband, drunk and cantankerous, he could have done it. Loose with his hands, he too owns a 22 and a swagger. And this one is called Laundry Line, and it's based on another one of her doll houses in which a woman is hanging from the rafter of an attic. In the attic, love letters scatter like dead leaves beneath the woman's dangling feet. It's Christmas Eve. Is this what happens when you go to gray? Wrapped in her shawl, she's roped to a rafter with white laundry line, spinning wheel, junked lamp, phonograph, childhood doll in white lace, as if, like the abandoned things, she quietly shuffled away. Downstairs, she may have decided for once not to wash up, to leave a dirty cluster of dishes. The snow is muddled on the outside path. The door is open. Looking closely, her face is scuffed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susana.
A pleasure.
Mervyn Taylor, Trinidad-born poet, is a longtime Brooklyn resident and is joining us from Trinidad. He has taught at Bronx Community College, the New School, and in the New York City public school system. He's the author of 7 books of poetry, including No Back Door and The Waving Gallery. A chapbook of Corona poems is due out in October from Broadstone Books. Currently, he serves on the advisory board of Slapering Hol Press. Country of Warm Snow is his book, published by Shearsman Books, a Poetry Book Society recommendation. Welcome, Mervyn.
Thank you, Karen. And that chapbook you mentioned actually is out. It came out kind of early, so. Okay, this is Country of Warm Snow. And I always like to give credit to where I found the title. And I should thank Susana because she took me to that folk art museum in New York City. And that's where I found what turned out to be the title. The title is taken from a note by the artist Joseph Bach describing a piece of his work, which reads, "Interior of some marvelous large islands at 2 million meters above sea level, unexplored, uninhabitable by civilized beings, a country of warm snow." This first poem is line by line. It was a line that Joseph Brodsky used teaching us when we were not getting any of the lesson. And so he said, okay, let's go back to the usual method, line by line. And he would do Auden with us line by line. When Brodsky kept us afternoons poring over poems by Akhmatova, I admit I understood only half of what he and the poet were saying. The island birthright in my bones withdrawing from the Arctic cold of their verses. And when, frustrated with our answers, he reiterated his usual directive, line by line, a way of making us feel the frozen arm of the gulag, only Joel, who was from Maine and who'd go back there to die in his favorite lumberjack shirt, and Lucy, her ash blonde hair covering her shoulders till that was all you saw of her. Only those two grew ecstatic over the word tundra. All I could do when Joseph asked if I was getting any of this was stare at the book, light fading in the fall evening, and say, yes, exile is difficult, however we phrase it. It makes one unbend like a diver at the last minute, afraid of entering the unfamiliar sea. So that really goes way back to my graduate school days, but only now the idea has come together. It's a poem for my son, Fatherhood, for Isan. It helps if your father's a poet and reads you sonnets, if one happened to stay in your head, guiding you through the maze that is life. If he dedicated one of his books to you, even if you were too young to take in a single line, you could come later to understand the whole thing was a long apology for what seemed like selfishness on his part. The way you yourself are accused of being distant, always rehearsing under your breath how a word fits compared to another. And though there are no excuses for letting my son wait by himself in a motel for his mother to come from work, making a new start in California, no poem worthy of the images of dunes in the distance, of that empty pool round back. They form as if I looked out with you, the way a poem will lay down lines for a train to run and a platform where we wait in case one is coming. So, a lot of the poems, I don't know if it happens to all of us, but a lot of our poems are apologies for not doing what we thought was the right thing at one point. Spirit Animal. This poem is a late addition to this book. It actually came to me here while I was in this house, locked down, so to speak. And I substituted a poem that was in the original manuscript with this one, called Spirit Animal. The spot where I am now is where my dad died. I imagine it's his breath I smell, his scent, as if he were a wolf, and I've tracked him here. I race over my mother's steps, her fingers rummaging through places he might have left us a treasure, such a secret he kept while building this house, such a manly thing to do. I sniff the branches where his coat might have snagged, tall firs up against which he might have rubbed. Instinct has led me back to the night he breathed his last, to the image of him panting, because I want his struggle to have been a fierce fight, the hair on my own body to bristle, my howl so terrible it will be heard in the next village, where they cannot sleep, wondering what my return means. I bury my head where his lapels would have been. I call his name, Juju, for his wolf to answer his sons tonight as the world hears and trembles. Okay, let's see if I'm going. This is a poem I wrote for an artist friend of mine who who actually went to school in Ohio, Columbus College of Art. And he was deathly afraid that the immigration people were going to catch him. And he would read these news pieces from New York City and he would call me and say, oh, I heard they raided some place, you know, is it? And I say, listen, nobody's coming to Ohio to look for you, you know, don't worry, you know. But he worried anyway. And he came to New York one summer to spend the summer, and I let him stay at my apartment while I was off someplace else. The artist as immigrant. I keep hearing their prayers as they lean against subway doors. And I recall the tremble in my friend's voice on the line from Ohio, hiding in his dorm after reading about some arrest far from where he was studying. The girl who said she would marry him, changing her mind at the last hour. And when I let him stay at my place that summer, he wanted no radio, no TV, fearing news of anyone being rounded up. He painted a mural on my wall and lived in it, while on the basketball court outside were guys from all over, yelling profanities in strange accents. Now he's safely married, living somewhere in Delaware, but his wife admits there are nights he still wakes in terror, scaring his grandson coming down the hall. Okay. Here's a poem actually written for Susana after her incredible book, Drugstore Blue. It's called Blue Corn for Susana Case. It was the staple of tribes making their way across the plains and into the hills, where their destiny was written in the snow, wolf tracks and howls before the ascent to heaven. Blue, each kernel telling a story of death from disease, of the hero Geronimo, his name breaking free, wild horse of a warrior whose war cry made the season of undoing long. Blue skies turning red for years, elders going to wait for the blind dealer in the place where he shuffles his cards, deals the hooded one. The Negroes chose this color for sad songs, the whistles of trains, low groans and absent smiles, gone, the most prevalent word. Women looking through windows, fields of maize hiding hollow logs, bodies in the swamp, love in their hearts, coming to the surface as gas. Blue, the gas ring under the pot of coffee, waking the worker in the morning, the poet trying to make some sense of it all. After all, it was a big country, fish enough, meat cured in the smokehouse. What was the language of their signals, she wants to know? What turned the corn blue? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mervyn. Elana Bell's debut collection, Eyes Stones, received the Whitman Award from the Academy of American Poets. Elana has received grants and fellowships from the Jerome Foundation, the Edward Albee Foundation, and the Brooklyn Arts Council. She was an inaugural finalist for the Freedom Plow Award for Poetry and Activism, an award that recognizes a poet doing transformative work at the intersection of poetry and social change. Elana teaches poetry to actors at the Juilliard School. Her book is Mother Country, published by Boa Editions. Welcome, Elana.
Thank you so much, Karen, and for organizing this, for having me. And thank you, Mervyn and Susana, for your gorgeous work. I felt like, you know, it feels impossible that we can do this in Zoom, but I truly felt like immersed in your language and grateful to have this kind of deep listening in a time that can feel really isolating and lonely, especially as we move toward the election. So to be able to drop into something rich and deep like poetry, I feel very grateful for tonight. So thank you. This is Mother Country. This is the book. And yeah, so I'm going to start with a poem called Miracle. I guess I'll say that the themes in this book, it's really about my relationship with my own mother, who I was and am very close with, who was diagnosed with Parkinson's when I was 21, and who also suffered a severe premenopausal depression, which led her to, it felt like a loss of the mother that I had known and grown up with. And that's something that I've lived with for more than 20 years. And then kind of about my own, like what we inherit from our mothers, and then what we pass on to our own children. So the book is sort of full circle in looking at myself as I became a mother. So this first poem is called Miracle. What else to call the way the bare branches I'd bought at the neighborhood bodega came back to life that winter? I carried them home, dry, wrapped in paper, stuck them in the square vase, and as an afterthought filled it with water. I don't know when I noticed the pale pink shoots sprouting from the submerged ends, wild reaching roots like ginseng or the hair on an old woman's chin. Then tiny green leaves began to appear at the tips, curling over themselves with the sheer effort of growing. I thought they were dead. And now I recall being in the grip of a darkness I did not have a name for and didn't think I'd survive. I could try to describe it for you now. The nights I woke with my pulse pounding through, the heaviness of each breath, how the effort of being inside my body felt like burning. What I really want to tell you is this, how in the parch of that long drought, the people I loved kept bringing me water. Water, though I turned my back and did not answer to my name, though I flung the cup away. Let me say it plain, I wanted to die. But something in me, some tiny bulb still alive under all that rotted wood, kept drinking, kept right on drinking. So I'll read the title poem from the book, Mother Country. My mother was a dead doll. I held her hand in the land of the dead and did not turn away. In the land where the animals made no sound, where the cows stood at the empty lake and wept dry tears, and the deer waited by the long stalks of dead grass, and everything whitened in the heat, I did not turn away from my mother, her eyes empty of their water. My country, dark and flat like tar you could drown in, dark as night with no moon, a lake with no bottom, nowhere to rest, and full of the bones of beasts no one knows the names of. The distance between our countries sang. The distance between us a song played on the strings of a great instrument we do not see but know is there, like the invisible particles that make up all matter, even the breath. Even the breath fogging the glass behind which my mother waits. The air suspended between us, no matter the distance. Dropping my mother off at the electroconvulsive therapy ward. Do I look strange? She asks. The other patients with their flyaway hair and unblinking eyes wander the floor. You look like a movie star. The nurses suggest I get some air. Her eyes widen as I edge toward the door, leaving her in gloved hands, quick for a cure. As a girl, I followed her down any steep or muddied path. I catch my face in the sharp fluorescence of the bathroom mirror. Have my dark eyes darkened? Was that shadow there before? Who will I follow when she is gone? When they wheel her back to me, faint bloom of urine on her gown. What happened in that room while I drank coffee just outside the door. Mother, I've done what you would never do, walked you to the edge, then turned away. Kind of makes me think of the poem, Mervyn, that you wrote to your son, like the apologies that we make to the people in our lives. And I'll read. Does anyone remember the blackout in 2003 in New York City when the whole city went dark? So my mother called me during that time and she was like, did I cause that? Did my dark thoughts cause the blackout? So, it's funny and also, tragic, but led to the inspiration for this poem. Blackout, New York City, 2003. My mother calls to tell me it's her fault. Her black thoughts, the cause of this city gone dark. Each window a blank eye in the stone, the lost bodies below swarming hot concrete. Black as Hitler, she whispers through the wire, and the steam rises from a grate in the street. I tell her how last night on our block, folks gave away beer and ice cream and all the meat they couldn't cook, and for the first time in years, the Milky Way was visible. I did that? She asks. So in the journey to becoming a mother myself, there was a lot of, when you're young and you're trying to get, not trying not to get pregnant, everybody tells you like, watch out, don't ever have unprotected sex, you'll get and then when you're trying to get pregnant, it seems like it doesn't quite work out that way. And so some of this book chronicles my journey towards getting pregnant, which included assisted reproductive technology. And I just want to say that I'm speaking about these things out loud and in poetry, but also to remove stigma and shame, because I think that is really important in our work. The epigraph for the whole book is Muriel Rukeyser's quote, "What would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open." So this is first intrauterine insemination. It was not making love, but we held hands anyway and looked into each other's eyes and not at the gloved hands as the tube went in. Alone in the cold room, I rest with my feet in the air and picture the light entering my body. I name it Surya, meaning sun. There's a storm coming. Soon this whole city will fill with white, a blank field. I will go out into the morning before the plows, out into the thick quiet and crouch, letting the dark fluid spill out of me to mark the baby that did not come. I will bury it like an animal. This time, I do not give it a name. All month, the blood collected in my uterus as if in a bowl. It drains out slowly, staining the hotel robe with my body's rust. This time, the blizzard does not surprise. Through the window, I watch snow swirl and cover the tops of buildings, the slick black street below. Nothing is new. Not this storm, not my blood, not these words. Letter to my son in utero. You are not the first. Before you, another seed took hold, and every morning your father rubbed my belly in wonder at what she would become. When the doctor said, no heartbeat, the air went out of me. My dead baby, I thought. They would not call it that. Embryo, 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 they said, a padded word meant to keep me from what I knew. Something had lived in me its whole small life and was gone. Forgive me for loving another before you. Forgive me also the weight of my love for you, already heavy with death. Forgive me. I am a Jew. In the middle of the celebration, I always smash the glass. And I'll end with this poem. One of the things I've talked about with many new mothers is the longing for a child and the desire for a child is very different than the reality of a child. Like one is very abstract and one is very real. And so one of the myths of motherhood is sort of like, it's this beatific experience. And the reality is it's ecstatic and beautiful, and also the hardest thing, to have that presence for another human being. So this poem is called Prayer, and it's for my son, Surya. When you are crying and I don't know why, when I cannot soothe or quiet you, when my nipples are sore and cracked from your merciless mouth, or when you refuse the breast, when I finger the purple stretch marks across my thighs and belly, the loose skin, the blood vessels burst around my eyes and cheeks and asshole, which are because you are. When I stink of puke and milk and shit, when I begin to lose my grown-up words from lack of use, when you push the cup of blended yams I've just prepared on the floor for the third time this week, and it isn't an accident, because you looked right at me before you sent it over the edge of your high chair. When I am on my knees before you, little ruler, begging you to eat, to sleep, to piss in the bowl, let me remember those many nights on my knees, praying to another God, begging for you to come, for life to take hold inside of me and bloom. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Elana. Thank you so very much. I really enjoyed this reading tremendously. And Susana, will you please start our conversation?
Yes, I will. Thank you, Karen. And thank you, Elana, for introducing me to your work. And as shown in your book of poems, you're sandwiched, as they say, between having to caretake a mother who needs some help and wanting, maybe, well, yes, wanting, but then being a little bit ambivalent in the final poem, to be a mother, and then caretaking a son. So I'm thinking about the poem you read about dropping my mother off at the electroconvulsive therapy ward, and the final poem, After Birth. And it's a craft question, I guess I'm asking. It's how you decided to balance the different forms of mother country that are in your book, and what kind of struggle there was to do that.
That's a great question, and it's interesting because some of the poems in this collection were begun. In fact, the electroconvulsive therapy poem in particular was actually begun more than 15 years ago, almost 20 years. I'm sure you tell your students this. It's like that. Some poems need like a long time to become actualized. Like I have, when I say 15 years, like that one was I have the paragraph that I first typed up, that was like, that became that poem. And it was a poem that went through many iterations until it arrived in its final form with the couplets and, some of the individual lines. That being said, that poem was, other than the final edits, pretty much completed before my son was born. And so I had a very different relationship to my writing life. I was much more, I would say, meditative. I would say much of my writing happened in residencies, where I go away for like 2 weeks to a month and have that kind of time. And After Birth, which is that final, I didn't read it tonight 'cause it's too long, but it's that lyric essay or long prose poem, was actually went right in those first months after my son was born. And I was prior to having a child, I always wrote in longhand. Every poem was crafted in longhand, many drafts before I ever typed it up, before it was ready. That poem was written in the notes section on my iPhone, like the initial drafts. Well, I had my son strapped to my chest, walking through the streets in Brooklyn. And I was like, okay, well, if I want to, go to residencies, then I'll just never write another poem, at least for another 10, 15 years. And so, I had to adjust my process. And so that poem really came, it was like a rush of experience. Of course, I didn't just publish the initial thing that I'd written in my iPhone. I, printed it out, I worked with it, I edited, I shifted, but it did come in, it did follow the form that it authentically came in, which I think happened as much out of necessity as anything else. And then I think to some artists who I admire, other mother artists, I think of Lucille Clifton, who talked about writing poems on napkins because she also had 6 children. When she was asked, why are your poems so short? She was like, these are the poems I have time to write, And also, not a poet, but, you know, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, you know, who wrote Women Who Run with Wolves, who said she was writing that while, you know, doing laundry. It's like sometimes the reality and the circumstances of your life create your craft and form.
Yeah. Can I jump in here? I thought that it made me think your poem about, especially about your son, and about cleaning him, and about the joy and the disdain in cleaning the child. I thought that it made me think about Sharon Olds and about her not looking away from things. And I think also it made me think in general about poetry, about what the poet does is kind of force you to take a closer look at things. There are things that we see from a distance or even up close, and we make some judgments about them, but it is only in overhearing something very private that we can finally know what it is about, you know, or know what a person feels, you know. Your poem about, oh, what a great title, something about when he gets to come and I don't. I think that was the title, right?
Yeah. After you had come, I had not.
But the very private moments that everybody, all of mankind, we experience, very private moments, most of which we don't talk about in any kind of detail, you know. And I think it is the poem that we're forced to write sometimes that lets us show and actually some very tender side of you there, very tender, the cradling of the person, you know, in the middle of disappointment, the cradling of somebody. And I think that's what poems are made of, you know. They're made of bringing the reader closer, take a closer look at this. Yeah, thank you.
Mervyn, you know I'm a big fan of your work. And one of the things that I really like about your work is how rooted in place they are. And despite some sometimes very difficult events referenced in your narratives, it's clear your love of Trinidad, where you were born and raised, and but it's also clear that you have a love of Brooklyn, where you also live. And I wondered if you could talk, you know, I'm thinking in particular of the poem about the murder in the school gate of the teacher, or
principal, yeah.
Principal. I wondered if you could talk about this a little. I know you haven't been back to Brooklyn for more than a year now.
Yeah.
Well, about a year, almost a year.
Well, the thing is that when you're not in one place, the news you get of another place is usually something dramatic. It's not news. Well, I remember an old calypso where where the lady is writing to her husband and saying, you know, Joan got married and so had a baby and so on. That's the kind of your normal gossip. But when you're far away, usually the news comes in tragic form. So there's news about a murder or suicide or something terrible. Like in one of the poems, the news about a man who drowns himself in a vat of oil, you know, and I think something in being away makes you hold on to stories that have those elements, you know. It's almost like you feel, and I think that's what a lot of people feel who are immigrants, that somehow if you had been there, this might not have happened. And it doesn't make sense, but you sort of feel that your presence there might have written a different narrative for your country. And that a lot of what happens is because you're missing. It's almost like, you know, sometimes there are circumstances you find yourself in, like being here and being on lockdown. It's almost like I feel that the universe conspired to make it happen this way. It's like if I have something to do with this, But in a small way or in a big way, it's true, right? Because the universe is only in existence because through your perception, to your own perception. It exists for you, Susana, because in your life because of your perception, and I guess the answer to that too is that when the gates are closed, something that Elana said in one of the poems, something about we're practicing our debts, that when the gates is closed, then that universe no longer exists for you, So somehow the feeling is that you, in a way, have to affect things around you. And the funny thing about being away is that life goes on, life continues, And so you can write about what was and write about how you loved it, and that's nostalgia. But to move away from nostalgia is to move towards realizing that every day, while you worry about where you are and what's happening, is that life continues, So I write about my brother in Queens, and I talk about him at 90 and so on. And then if I read that poem now, I realize that he's gone, it's a different reality, So there's always that, trying to live in two places. So I hurry here and then I hurry back so I don't miss what's happening in Brooklyn. But Brooklyn is as you know, Suzanne, Brooklyn is another Trinidad. There's everything, almost in a way, it's the Trinidad that I knew, because the music and what we appreciate in Brooklyn belongs in an earlier time. When I come here, they have moved on, and the young people here love reggae during the year when we want calypso to continue, So there is that,
Do you mind if I squeeze right in? Because Mervyn, I want to ask you a little bit about. First
Sure.
of all, I want to send love. I loved seeing, your relationship with Susana and how you know each other, and your work has echoed off each other. And I'm sending love to you from Roger Bonarigard and other massive Trini poets. From Cheryl Boyce Taylor, Lynn Trussell. Like I spoke to them. Said, hey, I'm doing a reading with Mervyn. They're like, he's a beast. Send him love. And so I really wanted to talk or ask, because I really, Roger and Lynn actually were part of my poetry growing up in Bar 13.
You mean Lynn Prokop?
Yeah, Lynn Prokop and Cheryl Boyce Taylor.
Yeah.
So they're dear friends of mine, and I really became a poet because of the reading series that I give credit to the Bar 13 reading series as really having a community and a place to go and to come up. And so I wanted to just ask you, like, I really believe that community can grow us up as artists, and, the way that certain communities become schools and movements like the Beat Poets or the Harlem Renaissance. And I noticed that in all, everything I read about you, and as you were acknowledging your teachers all the time, the influence of them. And I was wondering if you felt that there are communities that you feel have really formed your words or your sense of yourself as a poet. And also, I know you mentioned being part of the Bud Jones Poets, and I'm curious about that group and how it figured into your artistry and your becoming and your trajectory.
Yeah, the Bud Jones Poets, well, to do it quickly, when I first came to New York, looking for a job, and I just left undergrad school and looking for some kind of writing community. And I inquired around, and somebody called me and they say, why don't you call Nikki Giovanni? And I said, call Nikki Giovanni? Why would Nikki Giovanni talk to me? And she said, oh, no, just call her. And I called, and she turned me on to John Killen's writing workshop, which was at Columbia. And it was open to outside students. You could just walk in there and sit down. So anyway, long story short, I went to John Killen's workshop for quite a while. And then Sonia Sanchez had a workshop going up at County Cullen Library in Harlem. So I used to go up there to one on Tuesday night, one on Wednesday night. And at County Cullen, That was a huge workshop. I knew I couldn't stay there. There were about 70 people in that workshop. People got married out of that workshop, you know, under the thing about, oh, poetry, we're poets, we must belong together. So people were getting married like crazy, you know. So I met Wesley Brown there, and I said, Wes, this is fine, but we need to go somewhere where we could be a little more focused, you know. So I took Wesley down to John's workshop, and Wes and I became fast friends. He's now a playwright. He's written stuff about Richard Pryor and so on. But we became really good friends. And then the story about how we met Fatisha is too long, but we heard her at Liberty House in Harlem. And this incredible voice, you know, she came out of California. And 2 days later, I'm at my workplace as a proofreader, and I hear a voice come over the partition. And I said, I know that voice, and it's Fatisha. And I tell my then supervisor, I said, you have to hire that woman. She's amazing. You know? And he liked poetry, so it was fine. So anyway, meeting Fatisha and Wesley and some others, and there's a young man now who lives in Washington, D.C., Dennis Reed. Fatisha discovered him. He was about 18 years old and a real brilliant youngster. He was writing fantastic poetry at 18. So we together formed Bud Jones. And Bud Jones came from the title of one of Wesley's stories about, people were always talking about, you know, you gotta like, the brother on the corner is important. The brother, he said, well, who is this mysterious brother on the corner? He says, you talk. So he wrote this story called Will the Real Bud Jones Please Stand Up? And so we became Bud Jones Poets. And we sort of flashed through, you see them, people, there was like a mystery. Who's Bud Jones, you know? The side story to that is that this was during the whole Vietnam time. And Wesley got drafted. They wanted him to go. And he refused. He says, no, I'm not going to Vietnam. If I fight in, he said, I won't fight in any army, but if I fight in one, it will be in the Black Liberation Army. Yeah. And they sentenced him to like 5 years at Lewisburg Penitentiary. And so we became even closer because we did fundraising for him all during the time he was incarcerated. Bud Jones, we read in prisons, we read everywhere. And that's what Bud Jones was. And Fatisha was one taskmaster, Sagittarian woman, great poet. She read these incredibly long poems. They were hard to even read on the page, that's how long they were. And she would recite them from memory all the time. Nobody messed around with that girl. She was just a pillar of strength, you know. And if she didn't like your work, she just sort of banished you. I know people who are still suffering the wounds of Fatisha telling them, go to the side, go to the side. Unfortunately, she died of cancer. And before she died, for about 5 years, while she was going through her treatment, she began painting, doing these incredible watercolors, just going to the museum on her own. And so when I went to visit her, there were hundreds of them just stacked up. And on my walls in here, I have about 3 or 4 of her things. But that's what Bud Jones was. And that really formed a nexus for us critiquing each other and being really rough on each other and so on, you know. And it was just a group out of, when Fatisha stayed with Wesley one time, I don't know, accidents kind of followed her. There was something happened with the stove, and then the next day the pipes burst and so on. But Wesley was just a typical Richard Pryor. I said, Lord, Wesley, what do you, he says, well, you know what Shakespeare says, first time tragedy, second time farce, you know. Mm-hmm. And that's why I began with that. And then Dewad Phillip, who is here in Trinidad, I met him in Brooklyn, and we started doing a reading series called Flash and Thunder in Brooklyn, also down at Restoration Center on Fulton Street. And that was another thing that the whole writing thing was just, there was nothing else. That's what we did all the time.
Thank you.
I think communities are tremendously important. I have a a weekly writing group that has met since 2002. The personnel have changed a bit, but we have met every week. I mean, unless everyone's on vacation or something like that, for the last 18 years.
Wow.
And I also have a more recent monthly writing group, in which is also consists of friends who are poets, and we meet monthly pretty much. And then Mervyn is also for me a community, community of one. I met him when we were both volunteering at the for Slapering Hol Press at the Hudson Valley Writers Center, which became another community for me because they published my first collection and mentored me and taught me what it was like, what it meant to be a poet. But then Mervyn and I also started to exchange work, and I don't think there is anything in Dead Shark on the Entering that he hasn't read.
Wow. I was going to ask you, Susana, like, I just loved your reading and listening to your poems. I read some of the ones you didn't read tonight, but the one, I'm forgetting the full title, JHS, like junior high school.
Junior high school one.
Yeah. So I was thinking about it, and those some of the first poems in the book felt to me what I would call like a subterranean or oceanic quality, where there's like what's actually, there's sort of the things you're naming up here, and then all the things you don't say. And I feel in your work that it's very felt, like this, that poem, for one example, where I feel there's so much happening underneath that you don't make explicit, but that feels so like it's the tension. You're creating a real tension. I wonder if you can speak about the way you cultivate that quality in your poems and that tension between what is spoken and unspoken.
I'm very glad to hear that, actually, because one criticism I have of myself is that I sometimes feel I say too much. So it's nice to hear that from that you're picking up what's not being said. And the beginning of the book tends to focus on the objectification of women, generally women. And, sometimes that's not a terrible thing, but sometimes it is a truly horrible thing. And so there are poems in the first section of the book which seem fairly benign. I mean, certainly the first poem is talking about junior high school experience. Of course, it's we're at a dance. Of course, there's other things going on. There's someone up on the roof who's pregnant.
Did not feel benign to me.
Yeah, I mean, she's up on the roof pregnant, thinking
trying to kill herself
off the roof and so on. But there's also the kind of urban coming of age that occurs. So implicit in that is what's going to happen later. I mean, this is a kid, okay? What's going to happen afterwards? What's going to happen to the adult woman, the living doll, as the section is called? And so, that's always a question for me in these earlier, less explicitly violent poems. And you see it in the poem about Maria Callas. Well, this is what does happen when you are an adult after a certain kind of upbringing in which you've been taught to maybe pay too much attention to things that don't really matter all that much about your weight and all this other stuff. So, yeah.
What I find incredible in Susana's work is how I think she's a practicing sociologist, right? Besides the poetry, there's the professor
My day job.
to day job, but that's not what I mean. But she's able to bring all these classical people, these classical references, or art references in to support the poem, and it's seamless the way she joins them up. And then she'll write a poem, a modern poem, but bring Marilyn Monroe into it. And you can feel Marilyn Monroe sitting among the present subjects, And it's almost like, I think she's got the heart of these people anyway. She's sort of Marilyn come back, but safer. You know? But she can. That's okay. But she'll do that, right? She can make these references, and poems are great when they can also teach you something, right? Not just about emotions, but also give you something that might distract you in a way that takes you back like a lesson to some place. And you say, oh, I never knew that. I never knew that about Maria Callas, for example. You know, so she'll fill you in on stuff like a sidebar, but it works in rhythm to build the poem, and it makes the poem live larger than it is, rather than larger than the present moment. And you know, all these people, the guy in the circus, all these. Anyway, go ahead.
I'm interested in the public versus the private, and so I think that's one of the reasons I tend to be a little bit obsessed with Marilyn Monroe, who's also appeared in Drugstore Blue, probably appear in the next one too. She's just there, but both for her and a woman like Maria Callas, it's a very publicly lived life, and then there's a lot of other stuff behind the scenes that's more tragic. So we tend to say, oh, these women have such great lives and they're famous and they're wealthy and this and that and they're beautiful, but they don't always feel that way, and there's a certain suffering that goes on that is what interests me about them, because I'm not very interested in celebrity by itself, but I'm interested in the difference between the two personas.
Absolutely.
So Marilyn had a studious side, and she liked to read, and she wrote poems, but you know, who knew?
Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. This has been a phenomenal reading and conversation. I'm very grateful to you, and thank you to everyone who's joining us for this wonderful event.
Thank you so much, Karen.
Karen, we're very grateful to you for organizing.
And good luck with these books. We wish you all the best.